The will was still warm in Alice Cooper's hands when the lawyer told her she was not alone. She stood in the middle of Bernard Holt's cramped office in Laramie, Wyoming, the August heat pressing down like a wool blanket, and she read the sentence again. Read it a third time. The ink was perfectly clear, perfectly deliberate, and perfectly devastating. Her uncle, Harold Cooper, had left her exactly half of the Copper Creek Ranch, 4,000 acres of Wyoming grassland, a working cattle operation, 2 wells, and a timber stand worth more than most men earned in a lifetime. Half. And the other half, according to the terms of Harold's last will and testament, belonged to a man named Cornelius Donnelly. Who, Alice said, her voice very quiet in the way that quiet can be more frightening than shouting, is Cornelius Donnelly? Bernard Holt pushed his spectacles up his nose and had the good sense to look uncomfortable. He is your uncle's ranch foreman, Miss Cooper. Has been for the better part of 7 years. Harold was, well, he was quite fond of the man. Considered him almost like a son. Almost like a son. Alice set the document down on the desk with the kind of careful precision that meant her hands were shaking, and she refused to let them. She had traveled for 11 days on 3 different trains and 1 stagecoach to reach Laramie from Philadelphia, where she had been teaching school and quietly going broke while her estranged uncle ran a cattle empire on the other side of the continent. She had received the telegram 9 days ago. It had said, Harold Cooper, deceased, stop, you are named in the will, stop, come at once, stop. It had not said anything about a foreman. It had not said anything about sharing. And it had certainly said nothing about a man who had apparently woven himself so deeply into her uncle's affections that Harold had split the one thing he owned right down the middle and handed half to a stranger. Has Mr. Donnelly been informed? She asked. He has, Holt said. He was here 2 days ago. Well, I should tell you that his reaction was somewhat similar to yours, Miss Cooper. She looked up sharply. Meaning he didn't know either. Meaning he did not know. Harold kept his intentions very private. Mr. Donnelly believed he would receive a fair wage and perhaps a small bequest. The scale of Harold's generosity was unexpected, for both of you. Alice picked up her traveling bag from the floor. Outside the window, Laramie's Main Street baked under a merciless Wyoming sky, dust rising in small spirals behind a passing freight wagon. She had never been to Wyoming before. She had never met her uncle in person, only known him through letters that arrived twice a year, reliably at Christmas and on her birthday, always containing a money order that had grown gradually smaller as the years of distance between them accumulated. She had not even attended his funeral, because by the time the telegram reached Philadelphia, the funeral was already 3 days past. How do I find the ranch? She asked. I've arranged transport, Holt said carefully. A wagon. But Miss Cooper, Mr. Donnelly is at the ranch now. He has been managing the operation continuously since Harold took ill. The hands answer to him. The cattle operation is running. The contracts are current. I want you to be prepared. Alice Cooper was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with dark hair she wore in a practical bun and gray eyes that her students back in Philadelphia had described, with the unfiltered honesty of children, as like a storm cloud before it decides to rain. She had buried her mother at 16, her father at 22, and had spent the years between those losses learning to be practical in ways that left very little room for sentiment. She was not a woman who panicked. She was not a woman who was easily prepared for things, either, because preparing implied that the thing coming could be anticipated, and nothing about the last 9 days had been remotely anticipatable. I am always prepared, she told Bernard Holt, and she walked out into the Wyoming sun to meet the half of her inheritance that was already waiting for her. The wagon ride to Copper Creek Ranch took 3 hours along a road that was really more of a suggestion carved into the grassland by years of wheel traffic. The driver, a young man named Pete who worked for the livery, was cheerful and talkative and told Alice more about the ranch than she'd managed to extract from Bernard Holt in 45 minutes of careful questioning. Harold Cooper had built Copper Creek from nothing, starting in 1862 when he'd arrived in Wyoming territory with $300 and a stubborn streak. He'd run cattle and timber and done well for 20 years. The ranch was known in the territory as a fair operation. Harold paid decent wages, kept his fences honest, and had only shot at one man in 30 years, which Pete reported with the air of someone describing a remarkable achievement. Cornelius Donnelly had arrived in 1876, Pete said. He'd come up from Texas, originally, though some people said he had Irish blood going back further than that. He was 32 years old now, which made him 6 years older than Alice. He turned the ranch around when a bad winter in 1878 had nearly broken Harold's finances, had renegotiated the cattle contracts with the railroad buyer in Cheyenne, and had introduced a system of range rotation that doubled the carrying capacity of the land without overgrazing it. The hands liked him, Pete said. He was fair and he worked harder than any of them, and he had a temper only when pushed, and he'd never been known to push first. Alice listened to all of this and felt something complicated moving through her chest that she could not quite name. It was not resentment exactly. It was not jealousy exactly. It was the specific grief of arriving too late, of discovering that her uncle had built a full life, a life with people in it, people who had been present in the daily texture of Harold's existence in a way that Alice, 3,000 miles away and proud and stubborn, had not been. She had let the distance happen. She had told herself over the years that Harold could come east if he wanted, that she was not going to chase after a man who'd never visited her even when her parents died. But Harold had been old and set in his ways and attached to his land, and Alice had been proud and hurt and attached to her distance, and the result was that neither of them had ever crossed the gulf between them. And now Harold was dead, and Alice was riding toward the life she had refused for a decade. She saw the ranch before Pete announced it. The house sat on a low rise above a creek that caught the afternoon light in a way that made it look like hammered copper, which explained the name. It was a working ranch house, not elegant but solid, built from timber and good stone, with a wide covered porch that ran the full length of the front and a barn behind it that was large enough to suggest serious ambition. The fences were taut and well maintained. The cattle she could see in the middle pasture were fat and healthy looking. Someone was doing this work carefully, and doing it well. There was a man standing on the porch when the wagon pulled up. He was tall, not extravagantly so, but enough that he stood with the particular ease of men who have never had to worry about clearing door frames. He had dark hair that was just beginning to show some gray at the temples, dark eyes, and the kind of deeply tanned skin and calloused hands that came from years of working outdoors in Wyoming sun and Wyoming wind. He was wearing working clothes, brown canvas trousers, a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, boots that were functional and scarred. He was not looking at the wagon with welcome. He was looking at it with the careful, contained expression of a man who has decided in advance to be civil about something he finds profoundly uncomfortable. "Miss Cooper," he said, when she stepped down from the wagon. His voice was deep and carried a ghost of something that was not quite a Texas drawl and not quite Irish, something that had clearly started as one thing and been worn smooth by years into something more its own. "Mr. Donnelly," she said. They looked at each other across the 15 feet of hard-packed Wyoming dirt between them, and Alice felt the full weight of the situation descend. Half the land. Half. And the other half already standing there with 7 years of roots sunk deep into it, looking at her with dark eyes that gave nothing away. "You'll want to see the house," he said, "and the books." "I will," she agreed. "Both." He came down off the porch and took her traveling bag before she could object to it, which she was going to, and carried it toward the door. Alice followed him, and whatever she had expected from the interior of the house, it was not what she found. The front room was clean and orderly. There were shelves of books along one wall, actual books, a surprising number of them, some leather-bound and old. There was a fireplace with a simple stone mantel, and on the mantel there was a framed photograph that stopped Alice where she stood. It was Harold Cooper, perhaps 10 years ago, standing with a younger version of the man currently setting her bag down by the staircase. Harold had his arm around Donnelly's shoulders. Both of them were grinning. Harold looked happier than Alice had ever seen him look in the one photograph she had of him from childhood. She did not say anything about the photograph. She was afraid of what she might say. "Your room is at the top of the stairs," Donnelly said. "Second door. I've been using the room at the end of the hall. We can discuss the arrangement." "What arrangement?" she asked, though she suspected she knew. His jaw tightened slightly. "The arrangement of how two people run one ranch when they own equal shares, and have never met each other, and have absolutely no reason to trust each other." It was so precisely honest that Alice almost laughed. Almost. She kept her expression neutral instead and said, "The books first, then the arrangement." The account books were impeccable. That was the first thing that surprised her, and she was a schoolteacher who had kept the finances for the Philadelphia district school where she'd worked for 4 years, so she knew what good books looked like. Every transaction was recorded in a clear hand, every expense justified, every contract noted with dates and terms. Donnelly sat across the desk from her in what had been Harold's study and watched her read through 2 years of accounts with an expression that she would later recognize as carefully contained anxiety, though at the time she only saw the controlled surface of it. She read for an hour without speaking. "The cattle contract with Walsh and Company," she said finally. "You renegotiated it in February. The previous rate was below market by 14%, he said. I held off as long as I felt I could without Harold losing confidence. When he took ill in January, I renegotiated while I still had the authority. While he was ill," she said, "while he couldn't countersign." The air in the study went tight. "I have the letter Harold wrote authorizing me to act on his behalf," Donnelly said, and his voice was still even but only just. "It is in the drawer behind you. You're welcome to read it." She turned and opened the drawer and found the letter. It was in Harold's handwriting, dated January 14th, 1883, and it was exactly what Donnelly had said it was: a clear, unambiguous authorization for his foreman to conduct business on his behalf during his illness. The handwriting was shaky, which told Alice something about how sick Harold had been, and the letter was warm in tone, not merely transactional. Harold had written, "I trust Cornelius Donnelly with this ranch as I trust my own hand. He has never given me cause to doubt him, and I have no doubt that he never will. If something should happen to me, I want the world to know that this man's word is as good as mine." Alice set the letter down and was aware of something shifting inside her, not completely, not dramatically, but genuinely, the way ice shifts in the first real warmth of March. She had arrived ready for a fight. She had arrived ready for a man with a hidden motive, a scheme, a trap, someone who had maneuvered himself into her uncle's confidence for the specific purpose of extracting this inheritance. She had been rehearsing confrontation for 3 days on the stagecoach. What she had not prepared herself for was evidence of a real relationship, a real trust, a man who had apparently earned every piece of what Harold had given him. "The ranch operates well," she said carefully. "It does," he agreed. "You've managed it well. It's been my life for 7 years." He said it simply, without emphasis, but Alice heard the full weight underneath it. This was not an investment to Cornelius Donnelly. This was not a windfall. This ranch was where he had put himself, the years of himself, the better part of his adult life. Harold had given him half the land, and it was possible that what Harold had done was simply acknowledge something that was already true, that this man's hands were already in the soil of Copper Creek Ranch in a way that could not be extracted without damaging the thing itself. "I need to understand what you expect to happen," Alice said. "Going forward." Donnelly looked at her steadily. "What I expect," he said, "is that we will figure out how to run this operation together, or we will figure out how to divide it equitably. What I would prefer," and here something shifted in his voice, just slightly, something that might have been honesty breaking through preparation, is that we run it together. Because dividing 4,000 acres of integrated cattle range into two separate operations would damage both halves significantly. The grazing rotation depends on access to the full acreage. The timber rights cover land on both sides of any sensible dividing line. Splitting it would cost both of us. You've already thought about the division, she said. I've had 2 days to think about very little else, he said. She looked at him across the desk that had been her uncle's desk, in the house that had been her uncle's house, on the land that was now half hers and half his, and she said, "Then I suppose we are partners." The word landed between them with all the complexity it deserved. What followed was not easy, and Alice would not have believed anyone who told her it would be. The first weeks at Copper Creek Ranch were a careful, exhausting negotiation conducted in the daily language of livestock and fence lines and water rights, and the complex social structure of a working cattle operation. There were 8 ranch hands who had answered to Cornelius Donnelly for years, and they looked at Alice with a mixture of curiosity and wariness that she understood completely and refused to be intimidated by. She had spent 4 years managing a classroom of 30 Philadelphia children, many of whom had been actively hostile to the idea of being educated by a woman. She knew how to establish authority in a room full of people who had decided in advance not to grant it. She did it by knowing things. She read every piece of paper in Harold's files. She talked to Pete the wagon driver, who turned out to know everyone in the county and shared information with the generosity of someone who had never been told not to. She rode the land every day she could ride, had learned in childhood, and had kept the skill through occasional hired horse rides in Fairmount Park back in Philadelphia. The Wyoming riding was different, longer and harder, and through terrain that Philadelphia's managed green spaces had not prepared her for, but she was stubborn enough to learn. She watched Cornelius Donnelly work. She had not intended to make a study of the man. It happened anyway, the way things happen when you share a house and a purpose with someone, when the rhythm of their days becomes the rhythm of yours by simple proximity. He was up before dawn every morning, which she discovered on her second day when she came downstairs in the gray pre-light to make coffee, and found it already made and Donnelly already gone, a small thoughtful thing that she stored away carefully without comment. He worked the same hours as his men and sometimes longer. He was patient with animals in a way that struck her as genuine rather than performed. She watched him spend 30 quiet minutes with a young horse that had gotten tangled in fence wire, his voice low and steady, his hands careful, and the horse calmed down not because it was forced to, but because something in the man's manner made panic seem unnecessary. He was also, she discovered, better read than she had expected. This was, she recognized, her own prejudice, the automatic assumption of a schoolteacher from a city that education and the frontier were mutually exclusive. The books on the shelves were his, mostly Harold, he told her one evening when she asked, had not been a reading man. Donnelly had built the collection over 7 years, ordering from a bookseller in Denver, trading with travelers who passed through. He had Darwin and Dickens and a complete set of Shakespeare's histories, which she found unexpectedly affecting, and he had several volumes on range management and animal husbandry that were as heavily annotated as any textbook she had used in her teaching years. "You've read all of these," she said one evening in late August, standing in front of the shelves with a volume of Middlemarch in her hand. "Most of them twice," he said from the doorway, and when she turned he was leaning against the frame with a coffee cup, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Harold thought it was peculiar. He used to say I read too much for a man who worked with his hands. What did you say back? Something that might have been amusement moved through his dark eyes. I told him that men who worked with their hands needed to think with their heads too, or they just wore out their hands. She kept the smile from her face with some effort and turned back to the books. But she took Middlemarch upstairs with her, and she fell asleep reading it, and in the morning Donnelly saw it on the table beside her coffee and said nothing, only refilled her cup, and the silence between them was different, less like a boundary and more like a shared space. September came in hard and dry, which Donnelly said was unusual. The Laramie River was running low, which meant the irrigation situation on the east pasture was going to be a problem before October. Alice sat with him at the kitchen table for 2 hours on a Thursday evening, maps spread between them, working through the water access question with the kind of focused collaboration that had, she realized somewhere in the second hour, stopped feeling like a business negotiation and started feeling like something else. There was a naturalness to thinking alongside him that she had not expected and did not know how to account for. He was precise and logical, and he took her observations seriously in a way that still, 4 weeks in, surprised her when it happened, because she was used to being managed around rather than consulted. "Here," she said, pointing to a point on the map where the creek bent sharply east. "If you dig a diversion channel here, you extend the effective irrigation reach by," she did the calculation in her head, "probably a third of a mile, maybe more." He leaned over the map to look where she was pointing, and he was close enough that she could smell the day on him, horses and grass and plain soap, and she was briefly, intensely aware of him as a physical person in a way that she had been successfully avoiding for 4 weeks and suddenly could not. He was quiet for a moment, studying the map. "That would work," he said. "I didn't think of that angle because I was coming at it from the east, looking at the problem from the pasture side. You're looking at it from the water side." He straightened and looked at her. "That's a good idea." "I am occasionally full of them," she said, and he laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the first one she had heard from him that was not the polite social variety, and it changed his face entirely. And Alice felt something lurch inside her chest that she immediately and firmly reclassified as relief that they were making progress on the irrigation problem. She wrote letters home to her friend Clara Whitmore in Philadelphia, where home had been, and she described the ranch and the land and the work without describing Cornelius Donnelly much at all. And Clara, who knew Alice better than anyone, wrote back immediately saying that she sounded more alive than she had in years, which was interesting given how little Alice had apparently found worth mentioning. The first real trouble came in early October. His name was Samuel Price, and he was one of the 3 largest landowners in the county, with a cattle operation north of Copper Creek that had been expanding aggressively for a decade. He arrived at the ranch on a gray October morning in a good buggy with 2 men riding alongside, dressed in a wool coat that was too fine for the weather and an expression that combined friendliness and calculation in a ratio that put Alice immediately on guard. He was there to make an offer. "I understand the situation you're both in," Price said from his chair in the front room, warming his hands around a cup of Alice's coffee with the ease of a man accustomed to being welcome. "An unusual arrangement. A woman come from the city, a working ranch. A foreman who's gotten an unexpected windfall but hasn't got the capital to develop it properly. I'm in a position to simplify things considerably." He named a figure that was, by Alice's swift calculation, about 60% of the land's actual value. She watched Cornelius Donnelly's face. He was sitting very still in the way she had learned meant he was controlling something significant. His coffee cup was on the table beside him, untouched. "We are not interested in selling," Alice said. Price turned his attention to her with the kind of patient courtesy that was really a form of dismissal. "Miss Cooper, I appreciate that this land represents your uncle's legacy, but sentiment is not a business plan. You have no experience in cattle ranching. You are managing a complex operation in partnership with a man you didn't know existed 2 months ago. I am offering you a clean exit and a fair price." "It is not a fair price," Alice said. "It is 60% of the land's assessed value based on the county tax records from 1882, which I have read, and I said we are not interested." Price looked at Donnelly. "Mr. Donnelly, surely you can see reason here." Donnelly looked at Price for a long, quiet moment. "Miss Cooper gave you her answer," he said. "I don't have a different one." Price left with his calculation still showing under his pleasantness, and when the buggy cleared the property, Alice let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She turned to find Donnelly looking at her with an expression that took her a moment to identify as something very close to gratitude. "You knew the tax assessment figures," he said. "I read everything," she said. "I told you that." "I know you told me." He paused. "I wasn't sure I believed it was everything." The admission was small, but it felt large. Alice set her cup down and looked at him directly. "Have I given you reason not to trust me?" she asked. "In 6 weeks." He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. "No," he said finally, "you haven't." And then, "Have I given you reason not to trust me?" She thought of the account books, the letter in Harold's handwriting, the irrigation channel he had started digging 3 days after she suggested it without making any ceremony of it. "No," she said, "you haven't either." Something settled between them after that day. It was not dramatic. There was no declaration, no formal acknowledgement. It was more like a piece of machinery that had been running with a slight misalignment suddenly finding its proper position. They worked more easily. The small negotiations that had been tiresome became fluid. They began to finish each other's sentences in discussions about the ranch, not because they were performing agreement, but because they had genuinely arrived at the same conclusions through different routes and kept meeting in the middle. She found out about his past on an evening in November when the first real cold came down from the north, and they sat by the fire after supper because neither of them wanted to go up to separate rooms in the cold. He had grown up in County Clare, Ireland, he told her. His family had come to America in the 1850s, part of the decades-long exodus from a country still not fully recovered from the famine. They had landed in New York with very little, and his father had worked construction and died of it at 53, worked to death on an infrastructure that barely acknowledged his existence. His mother had lived longer, and Cornelius had spent years trying to send her money before she died in 1879. He had gone west because there was land in the west, and the idea of land was not abstract for a man from County Clare. It was the difference between everything and nothing, between staying and leaving, between dignity and desperation. He had worked his way through Kansas and Colorado and into Wyoming, and he had arrived at Copper Creek in 1876 with a recommendation from a rancher in Colorado and a very clear understanding of what he wanted from his life. "Harold asked me in the first week why I worked so hard," Donnelly said. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was beginning to speak in the long, low note it made when the temperature was dropping. "I told him it was because I was building something." He said he'd heard that from 100 men and most of them had given up within 2 years. "I told him I wasn't most men." "Were you right?" Alice asked. He looked at her. The firelight did something to his face that was not quite softness but was adjacent to it. "I suppose that's still being determined," he said. She told him about Philadelphia, about teaching school and the satisfaction and exhaustion of it in equal parts, and about the loneliness of a city where she knew everyone in her small orbit and no one in the world beyond it. About her mother, who had died of fever when Alice was 16, and about her father, who had been a kind and fundamentally impractical man who had loved books and been bad with money, and who had left Alice with his library and his debts, and very little else when he died of pneumonia on a February morning in 1879. About the letters from Harold that had felt, in the years after her parents were gone, like the last connection to a family she was rapidly running out of. "Why didn't you come?" Donnelly asked, not unkindly. "Pride," she said, with the particular honesty of fireside evenings and the kind of tiredness that strips pretense away. "I was angry that he hadn't come to me. I thought if I went to him I was admitting something I wasn't ready to admit, that I needed family. That the independence I had built was thinner than I wanted it to be. Did you regret it?" She looked at the fire for a long moment. "Every day since the telegram," she said. "Not before. Before I was too proud to know I should." He reached out and touched her hand. It was not a long touch, just a moment, his fingers against the back of her hand, warm from the fire. He withdrew them quickly. but the touch sat in the air between them with a significance that neither of them acknowledged out loud. And when Alice went upstairs that night, she lay awake for a long time thinking about a man who had never had land and had made this land his life, and about her uncle who had known exactly what he was doing when he wrote his will, and about whether Harold Cooper, who had never managed to bridge the distance to his niece while he was alive, had figured out in his last months how to do it after he was gone. Winter arrived at Copper Creek with the seriousness that Wyoming winters required. The work changed shape, less driving cattle, more maintaining equipment, checking fence lines for winter damage, keeping the livestock fed and the water troughs from freezing. Alice learned things she had never imagined needing to know: how to check a cow for signs of cold stress, how to read ice thickness on the creek, how to do the particular calculus of hay supply versus herd size versus temperature forecast that determined whether you'd have enough feed to carry through to March. She made mistakes and corrected them, and made different mistakes and corrected those too. Donnelly taught her without making it feel like teaching. He was good at this in the same way he was good with animals. He worked alongside her rather than directing her, and he asked questions rather than giving instructions, so that she arrived at most of the right answers herself and felt capable rather than managed. She recognized the technique because she had used it herself in her classroom. She did not tell him this. She simply noticed it quietly and filed it away with all the other things she was quietly noticing about Cornelius Donnelly. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Tom Buckley, who was 20 years old and full of the specific combination of sweetness and thoughtlessness that was 20 years old, made the mistake in December of making a comment in Alice's hearing about how it was unusual for a woman to be giving orders on a cattle ranch. He said it to another hand and thought Alice was not within earshot, but the wind was coming from the south, and she heard every word. She did not address it herself, because she was calculating the best approach, and the best approach took about 4 seconds. What she did not need to do was say anything, because Donnelly materialized at Tom Buckley's elbow within what felt like 30 seconds of the comment, and had a quiet, thorough conversation with him that Alice was not close enough to hear, but whose content she could infer from Tom Buckley's expression, which moved rapidly from defensive to uncomfortable to genuinely chastened. Tom Buckley apologized to Alice at supper with the sincerity of a young man who has been told precisely why he is wrong in terms he cannot argue with. Alice accepted the apology with more grace than she might have in earlier days, because she was beginning to understand that grace on the frontier was not weakness. It was strategy, and sometimes it was also just kindness, and both had their uses. She caught Donnelly's eye across the supper table, and he looked away first, and she thought that was interesting. The letter from Samuel Price arrived in January. It was not a second offer. It was a legal document, a claim filed with the county courthouse, asserting that a section of Copper Creek's east pasture, approximately 240 acres of the best grazing land on the property, had been improperly recorded in Harold Cooper's original land purchase of 1864, and that the land in question had actually been part of the Price family's original Wyoming Territory land grant and had never been legitimately conveyed. Donnelly read the document at the kitchen table, and his face did something complicated that Alice had come to recognize as his version of extreme anger, a kind of compression, a stillness that was the opposite of stillness. "Is it true?" she asked immediately. "No," he said. "Harold bought that land fair and square in 1864. I've seen the deed. The Price claim is manufactured." He looked at her. "But manufactured claims cost money to fight, and Price knows it. He is making our life difficult because we said no," Alice said. "He has been making people's lives difficult for 20 years, Donnelly said. He's taken 2 smaller ranches in this county through this exact method. Legal pressure, legal fees, long fights, and eventually the smaller operation surrenders because they can't afford not to." He paused. "He likely did not account for you when he planned this." "Why?" she asked. Something moved through his expression that she could not quite name. "Because you're a schoolteacher from Philadelphia with Harold's entire set of files and the temperament of a woman who reads land tax assessments for pleasure," he said. He was expecting the foreman without the capital to mount a serious fight. Alice stood up from the table. "Where is Harold's original deed?" she asked. "Filing cabinet in the study," he said. "Left drawer bottom behind the 1874 cattle records." She went and found it in 4 minutes, because she had reorganized Harold's filing system in September and knew exactly where everything was. She brought it back to the kitchen table and spread it beside Price's legal claim and started reading both documents with the focused attention she used to give to preparing lesson plans. Donnelly sat across from her and watched her work, and after a while he got up and refilled both their coffee cups without being asked. By 10 o'clock that night, they had identified 3 specific points in Price's claim that were factually inconsistent with the original deed records. By midnight, they had a letter drafted to the county courthouse, contesting the claim with documented evidence. By 1 in the morning, they were both still at the kitchen table, and Alice was reading aloud from Harold's surveying notes from 1864, and they were both tired, and the fire was low, and the winter wind was going hard outside, and Donnelly was looking at her with an expression she had absolutely no intention of examining closely. "We should sleep," he said. "In a minute," she said. "Listen to this." Harold wrote in these notes that he had the eastern boundary surveyed by 2 independent surveyors because he didn't trust the first one's measurements. That means we have 2 independent survey records, not 1. Price's claim can only work if both surveys are wrong in exactly the same way. Donnelly was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Harold never mentioned those notes to me. He filed them in 1874 with the cattle records," she said. "I suspect he forgot about them." She looked up. "I suspect he would be very happy right now to know they exist." Donnelly's expression was unguarded in the way it only was when he was very tired or very moved, and at this moment he was both. "He would," he said softly. "He'd be very happy about a lot of things right now." Alice set the surveying notes down and looked at Cornelius Donnelly across the width of Harold Cooper's kitchen table and understood precisely what he meant, and chose, for the second time in as many months, not to acknowledge it out loud. But it sat in the room between them with a kind of warmth that the dying fire no longer accounted for. They won the legal fight with Price in February. It took 4 weeks and 2 appearances before the county judge in Laramie, and a trip to Cheyenne where Alice spent 3 days in the Territorial Land Records office reading documents that were 50 years old. But when the judge ruled in their favor, the ruling was unambiguous. Harold Cooper's title to the East Pasture was clear, valid, and unassailable. Price's claim was dismissed with a rebuke from the bench for filing without adequate supporting evidence, which was the judge's polite way of saying what the assembled lawyers in the courtroom understood it to mean. Outside the courthouse in Laramie afterward, Alice stood on the steps in the February cold and felt something release in her chest that had been tight since January, not just about the land case, but about something larger, the accumulated weight of a journey she had not expected to take, a life she had not expected to find herself in. Donnelly stood beside her, and they were both cold and tired and quietly triumphant. "Your uncle," Donnelly said, "would have been magnificent in that courtroom." "I come by some things honestly," Alice said. He turned and looked at her. The cold had put color in his face. His breath made small clouds in the February air. He was looking at her with an expression that was no longer carefully contained, that had, over the months of working beside her, fighting beside her, sitting across from her at that kitchen table through the long Wyoming winter evenings, gradually unfolded from something guarded into something she could not pretend not to recognize. "Alice," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, not Miss Cooper, her name. Her actual name in his voice, which was low and direct and careful in the way of a man who chose words with the deliberation of someone who had learned to mean every one of them. "Cornelius," she said, and the name felt different in her mouth than it had in September, felt like something she had learned to say without thinking about it because she had said it so many times in her mind. He reached out and took her hand properly this time, not the brief firelight touch of November, but her hand held in both of his, and the cold made the warmth of it more dramatic, and she let it happen, and looked up at him in the gray February light on the Laramie courthouse steps. "I think," he said carefully, "that Harold knew exactly what he was doing." "I think Harold was a deeply manipulative old man," she said, "and I miss him terribly." And then, because she was Alice Cooper and she was fundamentally honest, and the long Wyoming winter had stripped away the last of the careful distance she maintained. And I think he was right. Donnelly's hands tightened around hers. "Right about what?" he asked, in a voice that told her he already knew. "About us," she said. "About what would happen if he put us in the same place and made it impossible to run away." The February air was very cold and his eyes were very warm, and Alice felt, standing on those steps with her hands in his, that she had arrived somewhere she had been trying to get to for a long time without knowing she was traveling. Spring came to Copper Creek Ranch with the sudden, saturated color that the Wyoming frontier produced after the gray compression of winter green so vivid it almost hurt to look at. The creek running high and clear with snowmelt. The cattle in the pastures with a restlessness that meant they could feel the change. Alice watched it from the porch in the mornings before the day's work began, with her coffee cup and the habit of stillness she had developed in the months here, and she thought about what she was building. She and Donnelly had not had a single dramatic declaration, a single moment of cinematic confession. What had happened was slower and more real than that. It was a series of small moments, an accumulating weight of shared evenings and difficult problems and easy laughter, and the particular kind of intimacy that comes from working alongside someone through hard circumstances, watching them be who they are rather than who they present, and finding that the person they are is the one you want to be beside. He had kissed her for the first time on a March evening on the porch in the light rain that came down soft and warm in a way completely unlike February's hard cold. And it had been a question and an answer at the same time. His hands on her face and her hands in the front of his shirt, and the rain on the roof boards and the smell of spring earth. And it had been nothing like the dramatic romances she had read in the novels from his shelves. And it had been absolutely everything. The ranch hands noticed the change in the household atmosphere with the unfiltered radar of people who work in close proximity to their employers, and there was a general settling. A sense that the uncertainty of the autumn, the careful negotiation of two strangers learning to be partners, had resolved into something stable. Tom Buckley, who had learned his lesson in December and become one of Alice's most reliable workers, made a remark at supper about it being a good spring, and looked at Alice and Donnelly with the particular expression of a young man who has noticed something but knows better than to say it directly. Old Pete from the livery in Laramie, who came out monthly with supplies, was less subtle and told Donnelly directly that he looked like a man who had stopped fighting something, which Donnelly accepted with equanimity and a slight color in his face that Alice found remarkably endearing. She wrote to Clara Whitmore in Philadelphia, and the letter was very different from the previous ones. Clara wrote back within 2 weeks with the maximum speed that the postal system permitted, and her letter said, "I knew it. I knew it from the second letter when you described the ranch and spent 4 paragraphs on the irrigation problem and mentioned the man you were working with exactly once, in passing, which told me absolutely everything. Come visit, both of you, when you can bear to leave." They could not bear to leave yet. There was too much to do, and also the ranch had become, for both of them, something that was very difficult to separate from the relationship itself. The land and the life built on it were not just context for what they felt for each other, they were woven into it. Alice was a partner in this ranch not because she had inherited it, but because she had worked it, learned it, fought for it with county judges and contract negotiations, and the land knew her now in the way that land knows the people who have given it their hands and attention. In April, Samuel Price sold his ranch. The news came through Pete, who delivered it with the satisfaction of someone who felt it was deserved. Price had apparently overextended himself financially with several aggressive land acquisitions in the county, and with the defeat of his claim against Copper Creek and a subsequent investigation into his land records by the territorial office, he had found his position untenable. The ranch was bought by a family from Colorado named Hartley, who came through in May to introduce themselves and were straightforwardly pleasant neighbors in the way that Price had never been. "I am trying not to feel too much satisfaction," Alice said to Donnelly on the evening after the Hartleys left. "How is that working?" he asked. "Very poorly," she said, and he laughed, and she loved his laugh, had loved it since the first time she heard the real version of it, and she still sometimes let herself simply be surprised by the feeling. They talked about the future seriously for the first time on a May evening when the light lasted long, and the ranch was quiet in the particular way of a working day well completed. They were sitting on the porch together, which had become a habit, two chairs at an angle to each other with the view of the creek and the pastures and the long Wyoming sky going gold and red in the west. Donnelly was quiet in a way that had a shape to it, the kind of quiet that was working towards something. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what we are. Partners," she said. "In the ranch, yes," he said. "I mean what we are otherwise." She looked at him. The light was doing something beautiful to the side of his face, and she was aware, not for the first time, that she had stopped being careful about noticing this. "What would you like us to be otherwise?" she asked. He turned and looked at her directly with the dark eyes she had thought guarded in August and now knew as simply honest. A kind of honesty that was so direct it had looked like concealment to someone accustomed to people who hedged. "I would like to marry you," he said. "If you are willing, if you want that." The sky over the creek was the color of Harold's copper water in the evening light. Alice had spent her adult life building independence as a form of self-protection, and had never, not once, imagined sitting on a porch in Wyoming with a half-Irish, half-Texas cattle rancher who had read Middlemark twice and could diagnose cold stress in livestock, and had spent 7 years building something in a landscape that his ancestors would have found incomprehensible, and had made it so completely his own that her uncle had trusted him with his name. "I want that," she said. He let out a breath, and the release in it told her that even now, even after everything, he had not been entirely certain. She leaned over in her chair and took his hand, and they sat together in the dying light and watched the creek and the cattle and the sky, and neither of them needed to say anything else. The wedding was in June. Alice had no family left to attend, and she felt this with a particular poignancy on the morning of the day, standing in the room that had been her uncle's room and looking at herself in the mirror he had left behind. She had made her own dress, not an elaborate thing, pale blue cotton with cream-colored trim, practical enough for a woman who was going to be working livestock within a week of wearing it. She had put her dark hair up with the small mother-of-pearl combs that had been her mother's, the only jewelry she owned that had any sentiment attached to it. She thought about Harold. She talked to him, quietly, to the room, which she knew was irrational and did anyway, because she was alone and there was no one else to tell him. She told him that she understood now why he had done what he had done. She told him that she forgave him the years of distance, because she understood now that the distance had been as much hers as his, and also that she suspected he had been planning this final gesture for longer than she would ever know. She told him that the ranch was thriving and the East Pasture case was fully resolved and the Hartley family were decent neighbors, and she told him that she was happy, which was the truest and most essential thing. Clara Whitmore had traveled from Philadelphia. She was a small, red-haired woman of Alice's age who cried at the ceremony with an unself-conscious generosity that Alice found steadying. Because Clara's tears were full of love and Alice's eyes were entirely dry in the way they only were when she was holding something very important very carefully. Bernard Holt attended and beamed with the proprietorial satisfaction of a man who considers himself slightly responsible for a good outcome. Pete from the livery was there. The ranch hands were all there, including Tom Buckley, who had put on a clean shirt for the occasion and looked genuinely moved. The ceremony was simple. The preacher from the Laramie congregation came out to the ranch, and they stood on the porch in the June sunshine. Cornelius Donnelly in his best coat, dark and broad-shouldered, and looking at Alice with an expression that was so unguarded and so full that Clara Whitmore, standing 3 feet away, had to press a handkerchief to her mouth. Alice Cooper became Alice Donnelly on a June afternoon in 1883, with the Wyoming sky above, and the copper-colored creek below, and 8 ranch hands, and a Philadelphia schoolteacher, and a Laramie livery driver, and a lawyer watching. And if she thought, as Donnelly's hands closed around hers and the preacher spoke his words, that Harold Cooper was somehow present in the warmth of the afternoon, and the smell of the grass, and the particular trick of the light on the water, she kept that thought quiet and held it close and let it be. The summer of 1883 was one of the finest cattle seasons in Wyoming territory in a decade. The range rotation that Donnelly had introduced over the previous years was producing its full effect, and the Copper Creek herd was larger and better conditioned than it had been since the ranch's best years in the 1870s. Alice had taken over the contract negotiations with Walsh and Company in Cheyenne, which she approached with the same methodical attention she had brought to the legal fight with Price, and she secured a rate for the fall drive that was the best the ranch had seen in years. Donnelly, watching her come back from Cheyenne with the signed contract and a satisfied expression, told her that he would never again be surprised by what she could accomplish, and had clearly decided to be continuously amazed by it instead, which was his version of the very highest compliment. Clara stayed for 3 weeks, and in the evenings after supper she and Alice sat on the porch and talked in the way of women who have known each other for years, freely and without performance. Clara observed Donnelly with the thorough attention of a good friend conducting an evaluation, and on her last evening she took Alice aside and said, simply and with great sincerity, that Harold Cooper had been a genius, and that she was going home to Philadelphia with the most satisfying story she had ever collected, and that Alice was to write frequently and give complete reports. The news came in August. Alice was expecting a child. She knew it before the doctor in Laramie confirmed it, had known it for 2 weeks with the kind of bodily certainty that preceded official knowledge. She told Donnelly on an evening walk by the creek, in the same amber light that had been present for so many of their most important moments, and his reaction was something she held in her memory for the rest of her life. A stillness first, the kind of stillness that meant something very large was being felt, and then a movement toward her that was so immediate and so natural that she thought it was the truest thing she had ever seen. He held her face in his hands and looked at her with eyes that were bright in a way she had not seen before, and he said, Harold knew, he had to have known. Harold was working from hope, not certainty, she said, but yes, I think he had a good intuition. They named their son Harold James Donnelly, born in April of 1884, on a morning that arrived with unusual gentleness, warm and light-filled, the creek running with snowmelt, the first spring birds making an extravagant noise in the timber stand to the south. He was a solid, dark-haired baby who looked, according to Clara Whitmore in the letter she wrote after receiving the announcement, like someone who intended to have opinions about things from an early age, which everyone at Copper Creek agreed was accurate. Donnelly was a father with the same quiet presence he brought to everything he cared about, steady, patient, warm in a way that did not require performance. Alice watched him with young Harold in the early months and felt something move in her that was a specific kind of love, the love that comes from watching someone you already love become more fully themselves. There was a photograph taken that summer by a traveling photographer who came through the county, a formal family portrait on the porch. Donnelly standing, Alice seated with the baby in her arms, the house behind them, the ranch stretching away in the background. Alice sent a copy to Clara. She kept the original on the mantel next to Harold Cooper's photograph. The ranch continued to grow. In 1885, they hired 2 additional hands and expanded the herd for the first time in 4 years, adding a section of land that came up for sale on their southern boundary when the previous owner, a bachelor with no heirs, died and left his estate to the county. The additional acreage connected the south pasture to the timber stand in a way that improved the range rotation significantly, and Donnelly spent the better part of that summer working on the new sections, with a visible satisfaction that Alice recognized as the deep pleasure of expanding something you have built with your hands. She had found, by this point, a full understanding of why Harold had loved this land and never been able to leave it. It was not sentiment, or not only sentiment. It was the specific attachment that came from having put your labor and your attention into a place, from knowing every acre and how it behaved in different seasons and what it needed, and what it gave back. She knew the east pasture irrigation channel she had designed and watched Donnelly dig. She knew the south timber stand where the light came through in early morning in long shafts that made the whole thing look like a painting. She knew the bend in the creek where the young Harold James Donnelly would learn to fish when he was old enough, which she was already planning. In the late summer of 1885, a woman arrived at the ranch. She came alone, which was unusual, on a small horse that had seen better days, and she asked for water and something to eat with a politeness that was covering a significant amount of exhaustion. Her name was Josephine Marsh. She was 33 years old, a widow from Colorado whose husband had died of a riding accident 8 months previous, and she was trying to reach a sister in Montana and had badly misjudged both the distance and her resources. Alice sat her down at the kitchen table and fed her, and listened to her story with the complete attention that Alice brought to people who were telling her true things, and concluded within 20 minutes that Josephine Marsh was exactly who she said she was, and that she needed considerably more help than a meal and water. She was given a room. When her horse proved to be in worse condition than initially apparent, she was given a better horse from the Copper Creek remuda, an older gelding that was reliable and gentle, and not needed for current ranch work. Donnelly, who assessed the woman's situation with the same practical fairness he applied to everything, said she was welcome to stay a week or more if she needed to recover before continuing, and offered to arrange an escort partway north toward the Montana road. Josephine stayed for 2 weeks and was, in that time, quietly useful in the way of someone who is accustomed to working and uncomfortable with inactivity. She helped Alice with the house and with young Harold, and she and Alice talked in the evenings with the growing ease of 2 women who had discovered they had significant amounts of experience in common, specifically the experience of being capable women in a world that frequently misunderstood what capability in a woman looked like. When Josephine left for Montana, she left with a recommendation letter from Alice written to her sister, explaining the circumstances of the delay, and with a small amount of cash that Donnelly insisted on as a practical necessity of the road ahead. Josephine cried when she left, and said that she had not expected to find kindness in a stranger's house in Wyoming, and Alice said that she had not expected to find a great many things in Wyoming, and had been wrong in the most gratifying possible way. They corresponded for years afterward. The years moved at the pace that good years move, quickly in retrospect and full in the living of them. A second child arrived in 1886, a daughter they named Eleanor Mary Donnelly, and she was born in July and came into the world as if she had somewhere important to be, arriving so quickly that Donnelly barely had time to send Pete racing to Laramie for the doctor, who arrived several hours after the event was already concluded. Eleanor was small and red-faced, and had, from her first weeks, an expression of comprehensive alertness that made everyone who met her assume she was older than she was. Alice and Donnelly continued to develop the ranch with the steady, long-view investment strategy they had arrived at together, not gambling on rapid expansion, but building carefully, maintaining quality, keeping the operation's financial base sound. Donnelly's range management knowledge had by this point become something of a local resource, and it was not unusual for neighboring ranchers to stop by with questions about grazing and water rights that he answered with a generosity that Alice initially thought was too open, and eventually came to understand as deliberate. That building goodwill in a community was itself a form of building, that a man who helped his neighbors had neighbors who helped him. The Hartley family to the north were particularly consistent neighbors, and a friendship developed over the years between the two families that became one of the genuine pleasures of Alice's Wyoming life. Martha Hartley was close to Alice in age and had come from Kansas with the kind of frontier pragmatism that Alice recognized and admired, and their children played together during the long summer days in the way of children who share a landscape. Harold James Donnelly grew into a serious, curious child who had his mother's gray eyes and his father's deliberate manner, and an additional quality all his own, a particular gentleness with living things that expressed itself in the way he handled the ranch's animals. Always careful, always patient, always interested in what the animal needed. By the time he was 4, he was following his father around the barn with a concentration that made the ranch hands grin. By 6, he could name every horse on the property and identify most of the cattle by their markings, which made his father quietly proud in a way that was deeper than pride, was really more like recognition. Alina was different, quicker and louder and more interested in the social life of the ranch than in the animals, fascinated by people and their stories, following Alice everywhere, and asking questions at a rate that sometimes made Alice laugh involuntarily, and sometimes made her genuinely struggle to keep up. Alina at 3 had the vocabulary of a 5-year-old and the opinions of someone considerably older, and she applied both freely to anyone who came within conversation range, which Pete from the livery found hilarious and told everyone in Laramie about at length. There was a day in the fall of 1887. Harold James was 3. Alina was 1. The aspens were gold all through the hills and the harvest was in, and the cattle contracts were signed, and the ranch was in the best financial position it had ever been in. When Alice was sitting on the porch in the late afternoon with Alina on her lap, and the sound of Donnelly and Harold James coming back from the barn. The child's voice asking questions, and the man's voice answering them with the patience and attention that never seemed to diminish regardless of the number or complexity of the questions. She watched them come through the barn door into the yard, the tall dark man and the small serious boy, and she thought about September of 1883 when she had arrived on Pete's wagon and seen a man standing on this porch looking at her with the careful, contained expression of someone who had been given very little reason to expect anything from the world that arrived in strangers' wagons. And she thought about Harold Cooper. She thought about him often, but on this particular afternoon she thought about the specific genius of what he had done, not just the land, not just the will, but the exact combination of qualities in both of them that he had bet on. He had known Alice in letters for a decade, known her careful honesty and her stubbornness, and the pride that was also a kind of wound that needed the right environment to heal. He had known Cornelius Donnelly in 7 years of daily proximity, known his capacity for loyalty and his intelligence and his specific loneliness, the loneliness of a man who had everything he'd worked for and no one to share the significance of it with. Harold had looked at these two people, one on each side of a great distance, and had decided they would fit together, and had used the only means at his disposal, the will, the land, the forced proximity of shared inheritance, to bring them into contact and let them discover it themselves. It was the best thing Harold Cooper had ever done, and he had done it from beyond the reach of argument. "What are you thinking about?" Donnelly asked. He had arrived at the porch steps without her noticing, Harold James beside him carrying a very serious expression and a small piece of interesting fence wire he had found, which he brought directly to Alina as an offering. "Harold," Alice said. He sat down in the chair beside hers and looked out at the land in the way he did in the evenings, the careful appreciation of someone who has never taken for granted the fact of having it. "Me too," he said. "He was manipulative," she said. "He absolutely was," Donnelly agreed. "I am completely grateful," she said. "So am I," he said. He looked at her, and the look was the accumulated sum of everything. All the evenings by the fire and the legal fights and the spring mornings, and the births and the photograph on the mantel and the diversion channel in the east pasture, and every conversation at the kitchen table and the February courthouse steps, and the June porch with the preacher speaking and all the small moments between, which were the actual substance of it, the actual material of a life. "So am I," he said again softly, and reached over and took her hand in the particular way he had that was both habit and deliberate, the way of a man who knew what he had and chose it, over and over every day. The years that followed were the years of deep settlement, the kind that comes when the building is mostly done and the living becomes the point. In 1889, Wyoming was admitted to the Union as the 44th state, the first state to grant women the right to vote and hold office in its new constitution, a fact that Alice Donnelly pointed out at the dinner table with a satisfaction she did not attempt to suppress, and that Cornelius Donnelly said was entirely right and long past due, and that Harold James Donnelly, age 5, processed with the seriousness of someone storing it away for later consideration. The ranch employed 12 hands by 1890. The original house had been expanded twice, a proper kitchen wing added in 1885, 2 additional bedrooms in 1887, and the barn had been rebuilt larger to accommodate the growing herd. The bookshelves in the front room were full to the wall and stacked too deep in places, because both of them were still reading, and both were still ordering from the Denver bookseller, who had by now developed the habit of sending them volumes he thought they would like based on years of accumulated evidence. A third child arrived in the spring of 1890, another boy, whom they named James after Alice's father, who had loved books and been bad with money, and nevertheless been a kind and well-intentioned man who had given Alice her reading habit and her love of clear language, and the pearl combs that had sat in her hair on her wedding day. James Cooper Donnelly arrived in April with less urgency than Alina and more than Harold James, a middle-paced child who seemed, from his first weeks, to have decided that the world was interesting, and he would observe it carefully before making any commitments. He had Donnelly's coloring and Alice's eyes, and a specific way of tilting his head when he was thinking that both his parents recognized as the other one's expression, and neither of them could ever decide who had it first. Alice wrote to Clara Whitmore with the news, and Clara, who had married a doctor in Philadelphia in 1886 and had 2 children of her own, wrote back an enthusiastic letter that included the information that she was expecting a third herself, and that they appeared to be running some kind of parallel domestic operation across a significant geographical distance, which Alice thought was probably true. Harold James, at 6, began asking his father detailed questions about the ranch's financial structure. Donnelly answered every one of them, not in simplified versions but in the actual terms, explaining what a cattle contract was, and why the rate mattered, and how the water rights worked, and what the timber stand contributed to the overall operation, because he had always believed that knowledge was not something to be rationed to children, particularly children who were going to inherit the land they were asking about. Alice, listening from the kitchen on a winter evening when this particular conversation was occurring, thought about her own father's belief in education and felt a continuity she had not been expecting. She had not expected a great many things. She thought about this often now, in the reflective evenings when the children were in bed, and she and Donnelly sat by the fire in the way they had done since the first winter, the long, comfortable silence that was full of everything it had accumulated. She had arrived in Wyoming in August of 1883, expecting a fight and a practical arrangement, and a piece of land to be figured out. She had found a home. She had found a partner who was also her equal, who worked beside her and argued with her and read the same books and thought about the same problems and made her laugh and trusted her and was trusted by her, and loved her with the specific, daily, unperforming love that was the most real kind. She had found the family she had been too proud to admit she needed. She had found herself, which was perhaps what Harold had always known she needed to do. In the summer of 1891, they rode the full boundary of the ranch together for the first time since the autumn of 1883. It was Alice's idea. She wanted to show the children the full extent of what they were growing up on, the whole sweep of it, and she wanted to ride it with Donnelly as she had never ridden it with him, not for a working purpose but for the pleasure of seeing it together. They took a full day, the five of them, Harold James on his own horse now, and managing it with the competence that had been building since he was old enough to be put in a saddle, Eleanor and James on horses shared with their parents, a pack of food, and a clear summer sky. They rode the South Timber Stand in the morning, where the aspens were thick, and the creek ran cold and narrow, and the light came through exactly as Alice had known it for 8 years. They rode the East Pasture, and Alice showed the children the irrigation channel she had designed and explained, with the attention of a former schoolteacher, how the water flow worked and why the angle of the diversion mattered. Harold James asked 3 questions and retained all the answers. Eleanor asked 2 questions and immediately applied them to a new question Donnelly hadn't thought of, which he answered with visible delight. James looked at the water with the tilted head expression, and then said that it was a good idea, which was, at 14 months old, essentially his full verbal range, but delivered with a conviction that made his parents exchange a look. They reached the north boundary in the afternoon, the section that had originally been in dispute with Price's manufactured claim, and they stopped there and ate their lunch on the flat ground by the fence line with the Wyoming sky enormous above them, and the whole ranch spread behind them south and west. Donnelly sat with James in his arms and Harold James beside him and Eleanor between Alice's knees, while Alice braided her daughter's hair with the efficiency of practice, and they were quiet for a long time with the particular contentment of people who are exactly where they are supposed to be. "Tell us about the beginning," Harold James said. He was 9 now and had been asking this question in various forms for 2 years, had been assembling the story from fragments from Alice's accounts and his father's and Pete's colorful versions and old Bernard Holt's formal one. He wanted the whole thing. Alice finished Eleanor's braid and looked at Donnelly. He looked back at her, and the look was full of the 9 years of it. All the seasons and the fights and the firelit evenings and the courthouse steps and the June porch and the growing children and the accumulated life of a place that had been given to them by an old man who had known them better, from a distance, than either of them had known themselves. "Your great-uncle Harold," Alice said to her son, "was a very clever old man. He was also manipulative," Donnelly added. "He absolutely was," Alice agreed. "He left this ranch, the whole thing, all of it, to 2 people who had never met each other and had no particular reason to trust each other or like each other or have any opinion of each other at all. He left half to your mother," Donnelly said, "when she had been too proud to come to Wyoming while he was alive, because he knew that when it was land and her inheritance she would come." "He left half to your father," Alice said, "when he had been working it for 7 years and had never asked for more than a fair wage, because he knew that when the land was truly his half of it, equal share, no question, your father would fight for it in a way that he had never quite let himself fight before. And then," Harold James said, with the satisfaction of someone who knows the story and wants to hear it told properly anyway, "you had to share it." "We had to share it," Donnelly confirmed. "Which turned out to be the point. Did you like each other right away?" Eleanor asked, Alice and Donnelly looked at each other, and the look was also a form of laughter. "No," Alice said honestly. "We were very polite to each other and very suspicious of each other, and both of us were trying extremely hard not to show either of those things." "When did you start to like each other?" Harold James asked. "When we started working on the same problems," Donnelly said. "When we started thinking together. There is a kind of trust that comes from working beside someone, from watching them do difficult things honestly. Your mother is the most honest person I have ever known, and I recognized it within the first month, and it was impossible not to trust someone that honest even when I was trying to be careful about it." "What about you?" Alina asked Alice with the directness of a 7-year-old who wants the other side of the story. Alice looked at her daughter and thought about how to say it in a way that was true and that a 7-year-old could hold. "Your father," she said, "was exactly who he said he was, every day in everything he did. He worked the same whether I was watching or not. He told me things that were inconvenient when it would have been easier to keep them back. He took my ideas seriously when he didn't have to." She paused. "When you find someone who is the same person in the dark as they are in the light, that is the rarest thing in the world." Harold James Donnelly, 9 years old, processed this with the gravity of someone adding it to a permanent record. Alina leaned back against her mother's chest with the satisfied weight of a child who has received the story and found it sufficient. Little James Donnelly had fallen asleep in his father's arms with the complete abandonment of the very young. Donnelly looked at Alice over the sleeping child's head, and the look was what it had always been, direct and warm and certain, the look of a man who knew exactly what he had chosen it every day for 9 years and intended to keep choosing it for every year that remained. "Shall we go home?" he said. "Home." The word settled into Alice Cooper Donnelly like the last piece of a puzzle she had been working on since she was 16 years old, and everything had started to scatter, like the specific rightness of a thing that has found where it belongs. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." They rode back south in the long afternoon light. 5 Donnellys on the land that Harold Cooper had left them. The Wyoming sky going gold above the creek that still ran copper-colored in the evening. The house on the rise ahead with the wide porch and the books inside, and the photograph on the mantel that had 2 images now side by side. One of Harold Cooper's happiness and one of their own, the old and the new. The man who had set everything in motion, and the life that had moved from that first motion in the way that good things do outward, continuously, filling more space than anyone had originally imagined. Alice rode beside her husband and listened to her children's voices, and thought that she had been right. That September afternoon, when she arrived on Pete's wagon and saw a man standing on the porch, and felt the full weight of the situation and its possibilities and its complications descend. She had told Bernard Holt that she was always prepared. She had been magnificently wrong about that, and she had been saved by her wrongness, because preparation would have defended against this, against the land and the life and the family and the love, all of it given to her by a manipulative and deeply wise old man who had known that the only way to give his niece what she needed was to make it impossible for her to refuse. She thought, "Harold Cooper, you maddening, brilliant, wonderful old man." And she thought that somewhere in the wide Wyoming sky, or in the copper-colored light on the water, or in the deep roots of this land they had all made their own, there was something that recognized the thought and was satisfied. The ranch would be here for generations. She knew it with the certainty of someone who has built something real. Harold James would learn every acre of it the way his father had, with his hands and his attention, and Alina would run numbers and negotiations in a way that would make her parents proud and her competitors cautious. And James Cooper Donnelly would watch everything carefully from under his tilted head, and eventually have opinions about it that were worth hearing. And there would be more years and more children and more problems solved at the kitchen table, and more evenings on the porch, and more books on the shelves, and more seasons on the Copper Creek land. And Cornelius Donnelly, who had come from County Clare by way of New York and Kansas, and Colorado to a ranch in Wyoming with a recommendation letter and a clear understanding of what he wanted from his life. Had gotten it. Not the way he had expected. Better than he had expected. In a way that required a woman arriving on a lawyer's wagon in August with Harold's will in her hand and the specific, irreducible quality of being exactly herself. The creek caught the last of the light as they rode in, and it ran copper and bright, and the porch was waiting, and the evening was coming down warm and full of stars, and it was enough. It was everything. It was home.